Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for your time this afternoon. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for coming. We'll give folks about one more minute to join in and get settled, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome again. Good afternoon. My name is Jarvis Lundy, the Director of Educator Diversity here at the Hunt Institute, and I'm excited to welcome you to the Raising Education, Rebuilding the Black Male Teacher Pipeline webinar with three incredible panelists that we have today who are doing incredible work across the country in the space of doing just that, rebuilding the teacher pipeline, specifically focused on teachers of color. And some of our panelists are folks specific on Black males of color. So we're excited for their contributions today. We have Harrison Peters, who is the CEO of MCEL, or Men of Color in Educational Leadership. We have Sharif El-Mekki, who's the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development, and Jees Desvariens, CEO of New Leaders. Three incredible educators who are leading the work in this space. And before we get to questions, I want to ground us in some data and some information about the impact of Black male teachers. We know that research as indicated, specifically a Johns Hopkins University study that many of us on this call are familiar with, reported that Black students are 13% more likely to go to college if they just have one Black teacher by third grade, just one. Now, if you double that number and make it 2, the students now become 32% more likely to go to college. And they often pose the question after that, what if they had 3 or 4 or 5, dare I say 1 per year of their education? So imagine how much impactful that can be for those students. The presence of Black teachers not only provides a sense of belonging, identity affirmation, but also offers diverse perspectives and opportunities to learn from all that benefit all students, not just students of color. We recognize that in order to dismantle systematic obstacles and oppression, limited access to educational opportunities, biases in hiring practices, et cetera, becomes imperative. When addressing how do we actually create teacher workforce. We have to dismantle those things, just break some of these barriers down to allow our workforce to be more diverse, frankly. And so we have our CEOs here today who do incredible work, like I said, who work to eliminate some of those barriers, from prospective educators to school leaders. And they run the gambit of retention and recruitment strategies and come with a ton of expertise. So we're thrilled for the conversation today. And I'll leave you with the statistic, right? The Hunt Institute recently commissioned a survey towards the end of last year that asked, frankly, is teacher diversity an important issue? We asked this of random sampling of voters and parents alike. 27% of our voters and parents across the country find educator diversity to be a big problem. And only 39% of voters think education diversity is an important issue at all. So conversations like these are vital to reshaping that narrative, reshape that perception, and pointing the spotlight on the need and the value of teachers of color and why we need to educate our workforce in earnest. And so without further ado, I will turn it over for some questions in a moment. Before I do that, I want to open it up with some framing, some formatting for our participants here. Again, we're glad to have you. We're thankful for your time you're spending with us for the next hour or so. And we want you to engage as much as possible. So I want to invite you, as our speakers are talking, to pose questions using our Q&A function. So any questions that pop up, that arise, that you would like to get insight from, use our Q&A function to gather, to potentially pose a question. Some of those questions might be answered via written response from our staff, but other questions, as much as we can, we will try to allow our speakers to voice over the responses to your question. We want to make sure you're heard, so we'll make sure to get as many questions as possible. And then lastly, we love a lively chat. So we want to make sure that you're engaged, you're responding, you're showing how much you're enjoying it, and we love to intrigue, and we want to hear your perspective and your expertise. So we love to light up the chat throughout this session and throughout the webinar, just so we can get a sense of just how it's landing for you. We always want to make sure we're doing better. So if there are things that we could do better, please send me a private message so we can always make sure we're improving. And without further ado, I would love to turn it over to each of our panelists to really give a minute or so introduction of themselves and their work to kind of before we set it off to some amazing questions that we've crafted today. So Harrison, you're first on my screen. Go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thrilled to be here with the Hunt, and also just really appreciate the work that Hunt is doing across the country, bringing an awareness to such a critical topic. And also the work of the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, who have been working on this for the last few years and creating awareness, but not only that, but establishing grassroots work for districts and states, and even at the federal government, to look more closely at the critical nature of educator diversity. Harrison Peters, proud CEO of MCEL, Man of Color and Educational Leadership. I come to you with sort of nearly almost 3 decade experience in public education, K-12, where I've been 4th and 5th grade teacher, principal at a high school, middle school, deputy superintendent, and have seen this work through the lens of many different people. And just because of who we are on this group, I think you'll hear just the critical nature of our work. And also wanted to just stand up the brothers that are on here, Brother Sharif and Brother Gene, 2 amazing brothers that I admire and have had the opportunity to work closely with, and just wanted to name that Gene has been doing this work for many, many years in this space known as the Godfather. He's helped along many of us, including myself, when we were building MCEL. So I always like to publicly give brothers who had a major impact across this country, not on only just me, but also brothers that I know in the space. So Gene, really appreciate the work you've been doing for many years. And we hope and pray that you'll continue to do this work and be an example for us for many, many more years.
Gene, with that incredible introduction, would love to have you go next.
See, that was Harrison's diplomatic way of saying I'm old, but that's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gene Ravines. I serve as the CEO of New Leaders. As Harrison pointed out, I've been doing this work for quite some time. I am thrilled to be on this call with brothers Harrison and Sharif, who's doing so incredibly important work. Thrilled to be part of the 1 Million Teachers and 30,000 Leaders of Color campaign to elevate and to advocate for growing the number of teachers and leaders of color. It's an honor to be with all of you today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And last and certainly not least, Sharif.
Yeah, no, it's really great to be here with all of you. Harrison, thought partner, leader. Gene was our founding board member when we started the Center for Black Educator Development to even get us off the ground. I was a transitioning principal and needed a 3rd board member to even start. And Gene graciously like, look, I'm busy, but I'll sign on to help and support. And since then, transitioning off, but being able to partner with them now in this 1 Million Teachers of Color, 30,000 Leaders of Color campaign. Look, I was on my way to law school when there was a Black man educator in Philadelphia who convinced me that the way I wanted to impact my community could be best felt by leading a classroom of my own. And so I transitioned into the classroom, and that was 30 years ago, and I never looked back. Just really appreciated the opportunity to be in the community that I actually, grew up in as well. And, to fast forward now at the Center for Black Educator Development, what we're trying to do is is re-engineer and rebuild a national Black teacher pipeline. And we do this by engaging high school and college youth early on, not only providing them paid apprenticeships, but also CTE courses in order for them to take this class while they're in high school, have the opportunity for them to be Black Teacher Pipeline Fellows, which includes an investment in their scholarship dollars as well as retention stipends once they get to their 5th year of teaching. So this idea is, any problems to engage the youth in helping to solve them, and that's how we, how we've been approaching the work.
As I said before, an amazing group of panelists. We could stop the webinar right here. We've already been blessed already. So yeah, we're going to go and dive in. Again, feel free as questions come to mind, drop them in the Q&A function. We have a few prepared questions, but we certainly will make time for your questions to be raised throughout the panel today. So I encourage you to continue to pose those questions. So Jean, having held prior leadership roles in New York City and having served as a member of Governor Cuomo's Ed Reform Commission, could you share some successful strategies or initiatives that an educational institution or policymaker can have implemented to actively recruit and support a more diverse teaching workforce, specifically aimed around the representation of Black teachers?
Sure. Thank you so much for asking the question, Office, and for the work that the Hunt Institute is doing around this critical area. I don't think it's a coincidence that you have Sharif and Harrison as part of this panel, because they're doing some amazing work in this area and actually great examples. Sharif will probably talk a bit more about this, but the work that the Center for Black Educator Development Freedom School Literacy Academy is a prime example, where they're focused on young Black students beginning in high school. Because oftentimes we talk about this, but how do we get our young people early on to explore a teaching career with an emphasis on Black culture, history, pedagogy, and activism? So that's a critical piece on how do we identify and build the pipeline really early on. A second example is, as we think about this, it's also important to recognize we need to recruit experienced Black professionals, especially those who have deep ties to the communities, because we understand the importance of proximity. Man Up Teacher Fellowship by Dr. Patrick Washington, who was a New Leaders alum, focuses on recruiting Black professionals across the continuum, whether they've been in military, firefighters, police officers, and get them to come into the teaching workforce. And what we all know is why it's important to think about the various strategies to get people in. One of the major problems we often have is around retention. And retention stems from the fact that we know who you work for matters. And oftentimes we've got Black teachers working for people who are not as attuned to some of the challenges, issues, and as a result, retention is a major problem. One of the work that we're doing at New Leaders, we formed a partnership with two preeminent historically Black colleges, with Morehouse and Clark Atlanta, to help recruit the next generation of equity-focused leaders, with a focus on recruiting Black and Latinx teachers into the principalship. Over 90% of our last cohort were Black leaders, in order to ensure that we are growing the pipeline, not only of teachers, but of school leaders. Once you think about the pipeline retention strategies, it's also critically important to think about how are we ensuring that we're providing advancement opportunities for school teachers and leaders, and creating the right network. And the work that Harrison and his team are doing to support male leaders serving in principal and district leadership positions, including superintendents, to be supportive and create the right networks, vitally important. And while everything I've outlined is great shining examples, we need to think about opportunities to take the work to scale. And the work that Massachusetts is doing is a good example of a state that's recognized the importance of this and is willing to make an investment. So in Massachusetts, they're running a teachers diversification pilot grant program that provides 2 million in flexible funding to districts who are implementing projects to increase diversity of teachers and school leaders. Again, none of these are silver bullets, but when you look at them in the aggregate, you start to see movement that's moving the needle, and that's really focused in an intentional way of growing diversity in both teacher and leadership recruitment.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, all that great detail. And Gene mentioned a lot of great organizations. I see Sheree posted some stuff in the chat as well, and Sean did as well. One thing I'll name is after this webinar in about a week or so, we will be sending out a key takeaways document with all of the recap of everything you're hearing today, as well as a recording of the webinar and a link to all some of these great resources. So don't feel the need to have to write these all down or save all of them. We'll send out a recap with all those resources shortly after in the coming days. So thank you for that. And Gene talked about just the impact of school leaders and the pipeline. And I want to focus a bit about early on and think about who those people are affecting, right? The students, as it kind of lay the groundwork for the incredible work and why it's so important. So Sheree, I want to turn it over to you, Sheree. As a former principal who has been recognized nationally for your great education work, can you tell us like some specific ways Black teachers contribute to a more inclusive and enriching learning environment for students of all backgrounds based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, part of it is and study after study after study demonstrates this, is this idea of having high expectations for Black students. And that's where it starts. And it's not just when you're leading the classroom. Those high expectations actually begin as you're planning your lessons, as you're developing your curriculum map, because you're thinking of what should I be teaching? How do I pull the resources? What questions do I ask? How will I support them? All of those really, demonstrate what we say mindsets matter most. Those things that demonstrate your mindset matters about high expectations. And study after study after study demonstrates that Black teachers can look at a Black child and see a future college student or a future, a kid who's will be gainfully employed. And a white teacher can see that same student and think, I don't know if this kid can even graduate high school. Right. And so those biases that seep in, it's not just, what and how is being taught, but it's actually how this kid is being seen, what their aspirations are being, respected and honored. In addition to that, one of the things that we've really seen that's critical is that there are many educators, and we know most of them are not Black. They are oblivious, confused, unaware of even how to help a Black child develop a positive racial identity. That's one of the foundations for effective learning, is to have a positive sense of self. And for a Black child, who, again, back to research, shows that Black children are particularly sensitive to their teacher's expectations, particularly sensitive to how the teacher thinks about them, interacts with them. That undermines the learning processes if it's a negative one, if it's low expectations. And then thirdly, I would say is this idea of what are Black pedagogical frameworks that have been historically used to effectively teach Black children. That is generally erased from ed prep programs. It's something that we've been very intentional about pulling from the research and instituting it into whether it's our CTE curricula or the paid apprenticeship that happens during out of school time. But as Dr. Okoso-Lesane calls these Black teaching traditions that have been erased. And typically when you go to ed prep programs, you're learning about white educational theory, white behavior theory from theorists who never even saw or imagined Black children being a significant part of public school systems. and we're using that. And some of them had downright negative things to say about, or theories and philosophies about Black children. That's how people are being trained, and then going into communities that teach. And then the very last thing I would say is this idea that there are so many educators today who have their only relationship with the Black community is through that 6-year-old first grader or through that child. They have no other relationships with Black communities. So how do they start developing, a kind of anti-racist approach, a more holistic and inclusive approach to not just teaching, but even thinking about these communities?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sharif. And as I think about that, and something you mentioned earlier was around a student who either is viewed as having a bright future and being a scholar, or is mystifying, essentially, like unable to not know sure what to do with that student, which kind of speaks to the need for role models, right? Of specifically Black teachers as role models. So Harrison, I'll turn that question over to you. Given your extensive career as a teacher, a school leader, a policy advocate, what social and emotional benefits have you seen students derive from having a Black teacher as a role model or a mentor beyond purely just academic achievement?
New question. And as sort of Sharif and Jean have said, the data is overwhelmingly clear and compelling. I've read somewhere where nearly 40% of the school districts across the country have 0 teachers of color. That is striking, that is frightening. When I was superintendent, state turnaround superintendent, nearly 90%, north of 90% of the students that we served were students of color. Yet 80% of the teachers were not. Many of them did not even live in the city. And this was a call out not by the adults, but by the students. They wanted a workforce that reflected them and understood their lived experiences and their identities. So our students are screaming for this. In addition, we know that educator diversity, it's a bipartisan issue and not a partisan issue. We all have to get around it because the data, again, is clear. When we have a diverse educator workforce, all children see exponential growth. We've got to go back to when we start to even look at how we assign teachers and students, when we start to look at our master scheduling. So what is in our hiring practices? What is in our master scheduling and our course development piece? And Sharif talked about this earlier. And then the other piece that I recently I always talk about this study out of Vanderbilt, more specifically about Black males. So the study cited when you're a Black male, if you're a Black male, on average, your performance appraisal, your evaluation is lower than your white counterpart, even when you're equally credentialed, and even when your students score at above the same norm as your counterpart students. So what we talk about is this real issue of bias. This real issue is belief. And when you unpack the data, and when you ask teachers what they want most, it's very different when you ask white teachers versus Black teachers. And obviously all teachers want to be respected. All teachers want to be paid, and we should. Those shouldn't even be questions. But when we ask specifically teachers of color, they actually want to be respected by their counterparts, their fellow teachers, as being sound pedagogues, and not only their teachers, but also their communities. And what I'm talking about is sort of this extra added weight, this invisible tax that teachers of color play. Because what we also know is when we have leaders and teachers of color in our schools, communities, they feel more connected to the school. Students of color, our most marginalized students, they feel safer. Students of color are less likely to be identified as needing special need services. And there's this pervasive study that talks about reading and math scores are higher when we have teachers of color. Access to gifted and classical and AP courses. It goes back to what Sharif said earlier, this belief, when I look at that child, do I actually believe in the promise, in the ability, in the innate talent of the student? So when we talk about what Black teachers mean to students, it's undeniable. And then I also heard Sharif, he wrote an article about a year ago that talked about the demand on Black teachers. On average, Black teachers work more hours than their counterparts. And this is because they're called to be so much more for their students. They're also called to be sort of this community whisperer, where some of our counterparts try to leverage us to sort of bridge the community gaps in the community communication. I'll just keep it that way. So when we talk about what teachers of color mean, the data is clear, both qualitatively and quantitative. There's no question of the value add that teachers, and I want to go back to this nonpartisan thing. It's about effective. We're not saying just go hire a bunch of Black and brown teachers. We're saying we also want effective leaders, because the data is clear. When we have teachers and leaders that look like our students, we have astronomical, clear results that lend themselves to the success of students.
Thanks so much, Harrison. And something you said, Harrison, that really kind of resonated with me, right? Thinking about, Black male teachers being highly sought after, and for some of those more intangible, I'll say, assets in the classroom, being helped to build culture and be that connector, like you said. We have a great question from Frederick Williams in our chat, who asks, this be, I think, Sharif, you can take this one, Sharif. While we know the need for Black male teachers for Black students of color is important, how do we make the teaching profession more receptive to Black male teachers, regardless of student demographics, specifically thinking about how we message to Black men as educators versus just fixers of culture issues?
Yeah, I mean, again, this really starts with people who are in position of power making those decisions of, oh, we want you, you look like them, maybe you're a big Black man, and we want you to police them and control them instead of instructing them. That's one thing. The other thing I think is really important, Jarvis, that we continue to uplift is that as far as Black men with college degrees, a higher percentage of them are actually teachers than any other profession. So we have to recognize that as well, right? Like, so, and then also, we see folks like Dr. Ivory Tolson and others who've done studies, Black men who attend HBCUs, teaching actually shows up in their top 10 career choices twice. It shows up at elementary school teacher as well as secondary school teacher. So, Black men are interested. And when you really think about it, in many of our communities, if they're not in schools, they're adjacent to schools. They are coaching, they are mentoring, they're supporting, they're doing these things. So there is a high interest for Black men to teach. So we also have to think about, okay, if they were interested when they're in college, why isn't that translating? And I think that's two major things. So I do think that Black men are already interested. And yes, we can continue to promote, support, make sure that it is anti-racist communities, do things like elevate the reduce student loan debt, increase salaries. All of those things are important. We also have to make sure that students' experiences, Black boys' experiences in school, is radically different. When you look at so many of the data points, there's Black boys who suffer the most in this schooling, and they don't feel like they're getting an education. And we all know there's a difference between schooling and education. They're getting the schooling, right? And then Black men who are showing up, they're often being told, I've had math teachers, as bad as everyone talks about, they need math teachers, they need Black men math teachers. These Black men are saying like they were told to be the disciplinarian. Instead of helping them codify what they're doing to build relationships, to have high expectations, to reach students, they're being asked to be the case managers for students, even students they don't even teach. They're saying like, well, they'll listen to you. Oh, they respect you. Well, I thought that was everybody's role, to respect and be respected. I thought it was everyone's role to be serving this leadership position. But often the lone and perhaps lonely Black man in that building who was a teacher is being asked to do something else, or their classroom is being manipulated in a way, their roster is being manipulated in a way like, hey, you take all of these students that others want to write off, abandon, disregard, and ignore, and label. And one of the things they're labeled, we talk about all the label and specifications, special ed, problematic. Often they end up labeled as only that Black man or that Black teacher can handle. And that's in itself is a falsification, and it undermines what the culture of a school community should actually be, and what everyone's professional responsibilities are to build relationships, to continuously improve their craft, and not look at it as like, oh, that is that single person because they share the same race. And lastly, I would say you mentioned some data in the beginning around improvement for Black boys. Again, being super sensitive, Black boys, especially those from under-resourced communities, they can be up to 39% less likely to drop out of school if they have a single Black teacher, and up to 29% more likely to go to college if they have a single, let alone what does it look like for 180 days over the course of all 13 years.
Absolutely. And Gene, if you think about that connection to what Sharif was just speaking about, right? About that creating that sense, feeling that sense of culture and belonging, right? How can school leaders and leaders generally of school systems and of schools foster a school culture that supports Black male teachers feeling a sense of belonging as early childhood educators?
Yeah. It's a critically important question, and Sharif touched on some of this as well as Harrison. The culture is such a critical component in terms of the role of both the teacher and the school leader to create that sense of welcoming and belonging. In this sense of high expectations around what is possible, oftentimes we hear in number of schools where teachers, leaders are talking about why Black students can't learn and making excuses, sometimes even if it's well-meaning and well-intentioned, and that does not serve our students well. It is about ensuring that the level of expectations are set and the support systems are in place to ensure that they're successful. And what we're seeing through the work we're doing with Morehouse and Clark Atlanta is the level of retention that is much higher because our leaders are overwhelmingly leaders of color with teachers. And the fact that attendance is much higher within these schools, suspension much lower, and graduation is much higher. And that is not by coincidence. It is the focus on creating the right culture, welcoming environment, high expectations for kids, and ensuring that the right supports are in place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Harrison, as someone who is working to build out those supports and build up the pipeline for leaders especially, and as we think about just the various great works of organizations like yours, sometimes there is the perception might be a lack of cohesive network to ensure that effective policies or practices are being adopted at scale. And so Sterling Grimes asked this question: where have you seen success in strengthening the conditions that support promising models like your own?
Yeah, so one of the things, this is a selfish plug, but I think extremely applicable. We just launched last year our Resilient Representative Leadership Framework. And it's a guidebook that helps leaders of color navigate spaces that aren't designed for them to be successful, first of all. But the other piece of the toolkit are self-reflection opportunities for leaders of color. But get this, they're also reflective tools for school districts to take a good look in the mirror to say, are we creating the conditions for our leaders of color to be successful? Also, if you are an ally, a co-pilot, or a co-conspirator in this work, and maybe you supervise leaders of color, or maybe you work and develop them, there's also a tool for you to self-reflect and say, as a leader, am I proximal to the needs and the conditions that my leaders of color are growing and developing in? And am I creating those fertile grounds for my aspiring leaders to be successful? So when we think about just the work of MCEL, it was founded sort of on my lived experiences as a leader of color. And I'm going to double click on the conversation that Sharif had earlier. When I was a 4th and 5th grade teacher, brand new teacher, I was hired on the same day as a young lady who identified as a white female. Her name was Kristen. We'll change the name. Kristen and I were both brand new teachers. We walked into the principal's office. We got our roster of students, 23, 24 kids apiece. And when we got our rosters, we also got our duty assignments. So when I looked at my list of duty assignments, I was the timeout guy, the grade level timeout guy, bus duty, lunch duty, after school duty, Saturday coaching, mentoring. You know, all of those things are critically important. And I was pretty darn good at it too. But Kristen's set of duties was different. She led the curriculum committee. She was on the literacy committee, the school improvement. So right off the bat, our careers were in separate directions. And when I said I was pretty good, I was, because I was actually teacher of the year. And I was hot stuff until I sat down and I was like, well, Gene, I think I want to be an assistant principal. And then they ask you that question, well, Harrison, you've been teacher of the year. Yeah, but when you walk into a PLC, how do you help teachers deconstruct meaning of a standard and rebuild that and align an assessment? I was like, what? But it's because of what's pervasive in the challenges or in the careers of Black men. We're typecast in roles. So when we look at MCEL, it started with the vignettes and stories like this from around the country, brothers feeling isolated, feeling left alone, quite frankly, feeling set up, also not given the runway to turn their schools and organizations around like many of their counterparts were. And then we started as sort of like this affinity space where brothers need to come together and we need to just heal and be our authentic selves. And then we quickly realized that we're only 3% of the market. So when you look across the country, we're only 3% of the ecosystem. And as we've already talked about, we're leaving faster than any other demographic. And we're not even choosing education. And Brother El Mekki said something earlier about how we view Black boys. I always say, there are a few things that's going to change this pipeline. So one, we have to appreciate teachers in the profession. We've got to bring this belief that teachers matter. We've got to pay them. That makes sense. But the other thing is we've got to change the trajectory and the experiences for our students of color. How in the Washington, D.C. are we going to expect kids of color to come back and teach in an institution where I was more than likely labeled ESC, where I was more than likely arrested or suspended, or all of those things that we know plague children. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure that the experiences of our teachers and our leaders, of our students are that, so they'll come back and have this sense of pride. The best, I think, implications for great teaching and getting kids to come into education are teachers championing a profession. So how do we bring teachers to the forefront and say, hey, I work in a profession that values me, which is, I think, the cornerstone of MCEL. Our big bet is leadership matters. There's no question that teachers make the magic happen. But as a teacher, you know, and teachers say this, I'll get in my car in the morning, and I'll drive all the way across town to work for a leader that gives me agency, gives me voice, and listens to me. But I would not walk out my front door across the street to work for a leader that's ineffective. So we believe part of solving this teacher conundrum is getting great leaders in place. And then Wallace has recently posted some research that leaders of color, and not just leaders of color, but the role of school leader is critically important for student learning. And in many instances, when you're an effective leader, your impact on student achievement is greater or close to being greater than that of teachers. And just magnify that, juxtapose that with not only having effective leaders, but effective leaders of color, which the data also supports that leaders of color absolutely matter. So when we talk about the work of MCEL, we want to make sure that we are looking at the ecosystem, because right now, only 10% of superintendents are superintendents of color. Less than 20% of school board members are people of color. Less than 20% of principals across the country are people of color. Yet our ecosystem encompasses over 50% students of color. So there is, and these folks determine what books we can read, what resources are leveraged, what schools and what boundaries and all of those things. So having people that look like our children at the decision-making and table of influence is equally critical. So that's the role and the work that MCEL does. And we help school districts and leaders think about how they're supporting, developing, and growing their leaders of color very differently.
Harrison, yeah, thank you so much for that. And you posed some really, striking statistics, right? And what that reminds me of is thinking about, we're in Black History Month, right? We reminisce about the state of education prior to the Brown v. Board education. And so we have a question from Esther Coleman, who, Gene, comments on the picture behind you of Ruby Bridges. So, during desegregation, we lost thousands of Black teachers, lost their jobs, right? Many of them held master's degrees and were highly qualified. And so, Gene, then we'll open this for any of you, right? Would any of you agree that we have not recovered from those losses? And if so, how can we understand? How would you kind of assess the landscape post that decision?
In a nutshell, I'd say that assessment is absolutely correct in terms of us not recovering. And we didn't recover for a host of reasons, as ongoing discrimination, as people also have gained more opportunities, and as the teaching profession has been de-emphasized, just people have made a decision to just fundamentally opt out. And the whole narrative around what it means to teach, I don't think we have collectively done enough job to talk about the powerful impact that a person of color can have on young people, particularly under-resourced young people of color, to step in the role. But without a doubt, from my perspective, we've not fully recovered as a community.
Yeah, Sharif?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think, one of the things to take a look at in that regard are, our researchers. I was just putting in the chat, Chris Stewart often talks about regaining the Black educational capital and making sure that that gets uplifted again. And we have scholars who are out there who've been doing it consistently over the years, from Dr. Carter G. Woodson, W.B. Du Bois, Lucy Craft Laney, Mary McLeod Bethune. There's so many, and pulling from those, where you have today Lisa Delpit, Gloria Lasson Billings, Bettina Love, others who are excavating that and kind of reminding us. Greg Carr often talks about reminding, mind again what happened, what we should be doing, and what are these Black pedagogical frameworks that are often not taught. And if we're still, I visit teacher colleges sometimes, and then when I see the materials, people are still using Horace Mann, John Dewey, B.F. Skinner, Piaget, the Vivek guy, I forget his name, right? Like, to train people, develop people how to lead classrooms, and devoid of what are the Black pedagogical frameworks. My friend Dr. Koso was saying, she's writing a book. She's about the Black teaching traditions that have always been used, that are continue to use. It was used during independent Black school movements. They were used during, even today in pockets. Those can be really codified and developed. These are the same principles that we're using to introduce our high school and college apprentices with, right? And so it is out there. We just have to recapture and pull them into the work.
Right, perfect. As we think about the work, Harrison, thinking about just the state of play we're now, the context that we're in right now, right, with the rise of defunding of DEI initiatives and programs, and just some of the more hot button issues around diversity in name. And so, given that, how are you approaching the work, and what can be done to support teacher diversity and teacher diversification efforts in the midst of the current political climate that we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and I'm going to try to be my airtime with this. So when we talk about the work we're doing, and I'll just double click on the campaign. So the 1 million teachers, 30,000 leaders of campaign talks about, are we even collecting the data to understand what the workforce looks like? That's one. Then the other piece talks about what are the policies that make sense to help states, local, federal government diversify the workforce. Things like certification, like how much can you attribute a teacher's certification to actual effectiveness? There's a lot of data. And I know that's a contentious conversation, but how do we tie effectiveness to certification? Like that's policies like last in, first out. When I was a superintendent, we'd spend millions of dollars recruiting teachers of color. And then the end of the year, when it's time to relook at staffing, we lose a lot of them because of last in, first out policy. So, and then helping districts understand. So two things. A, I live in Florida, so those DEI conversations are non-existent. But I was at the university having a conversation with a group of doctoral students. And I was talking about the work of MCEL and the campaign. There's a young man from DC that talked about, well, you do this work around the country. Florida's very different. How are you talking about DE&I in Florida? And I was like, you've got to think about the long game and what you want to accomplish. So perhaps in Florida, it's not DE&I, but every person in this room is a leader. And what you can go back to your school and do tomorrow is say, I don't care what kids look like, but every kid in this school will be successful no matter what. And we're going to make sure that they have the just right resources and supports to be successful. So no, it's not DE&I, but it's every kid having this opportunity. And we're going to work to make sure that our family, our faculty reflects the values of our community and our children. That's one. And then the other piece, I think, is a caution, a really important lesson that I learned. So one of the school districts that we've worked with, they called us and said, hey, we have north of 100 schools and we have no male leaders of color. And we think that that's a problem. And I said, I couldn't agree more. And they said, well, can MCEL help us? And I said, well, yeah, define what you mean by help. And what they said is, well, we've got these group of men of color that we are really high on, and we want you to come work and mentor them. That's always a caution from me. I appreciate the gesture, but a caution. And I'll share with you the caution. The caution is, I said, well, how about I do this? How about I fly out, give me a private space with these young men, and then I reserve the right to come and speak with, was the superintendent and their assistant superintendent of leadership development, have a conversation with you. So even before I got onto the plane, I knew what the conversation was. Walk in the room, introduce myself and say, man, why don't y'all want to be principals in the school district? Why don't you want to be leaders? And it's that story. You know what? We don't feel supported. We saw what happened to the last Black man. You don't give us the space to learn and grow. We don't get the resources. You expect us to turn around schools overnight, like all of those things. And we knew that. But what it gave me the license to go back and have a frank conversation with the leadership team was, listen, I appreciate your ability and your need and your want to get mentors for these young men. And I am not anti-mentor. Representative-based mentoring is critical. But what I wanted them to understand was the message that they were sending. When you bring MCEL in, you're saying you need to fix these men of color because something is wrong. Our Black and brown men aren't broken. Now, do we need to get better? Absolutely. So the conversation shifted as, yes, we will be happy to work and mentor these young men if we can work with your HR department on looking at your pipeline and your policy. If we can work with the cabinet and the superintendent to talk about what are the conditions that you're creating for leaders of color. If we can work with your principal supervisors who actually liaise with school district, with the central office and supervise principals, and they have the clearest, closest proximity to the next generation of principals that are getting hired. So we'll happily come in and work with these young men if they can also see some system shifts. because I don't care how effective and how strong and how chiseled and how agile that we make our leaders of color, if the systems aren't designed to support them, then they're going to be marginally effective. So it has to be this lens, this juxtaposition as we're getting better as leaders, but pushing the system for changes as well. I cannot say how absolutely critical it is to push for that system level change as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Harrison. And think about system level change, Gene. What are gaps? Where can we still do work? Where is there need for more collective action and effort for our teacher diversification efforts?
Yeah, I just want to underscore Harrison's point around the importance of the system level focus, because all of the great examples we talked about and some of the great work we're doing collectively, including with the Hunt Institute, is outside of the system. And if you're truly going to drive scale, you need a level of system level engagement. And as we think about this, all too often we take a deficit approach and a defensive approach. And from my perspective, I view this work as asset building. When you have a majority of your students who are diverse, and they will continue to be diverse given the numbers in the direction we're going in as a country, it is incumbent upon us to think about how do we continue to diversify the workforce to reflect the student body, and to also recognize that we have a number of teachers and leaders who are retiring. So how do we view this from a growth mindset, even despite the noise that we often hear? Get the level of buy-in that goes beyond the superintendent, because unless you've got buy-in and support at the board level, the civic community, the business community, to see this as beneficial to all parties and not a nice to have, and not to get caught up in the whole political rhetoric, it's unlikely to be able to be sustained and to grow and thrive in a way that we know is necessary. Because while we spent a great deal of time talking about the benefits to low-income students, particularly low-income students of color who are under-resourced, having a diverse workforce, leaders and teachers, is beneficial to all students, particularly in a world that continues to be diverse. And it is incumbent upon decision makers and upon us to help them understand the benefits of that approach, so we don't have to get caught up in the political dynamics that could often derail and be an unnecessary distraction.
And you know what? I just want to add, Jarvis, to Gene's point. Not only is a diverse educated workforce important for all students, and all really means all, it's also extremely important for the ecosystem writ large. I can't tell you how many white teachers have said, you know what, some of my best professional learning has been teaching in proximity to a Black and brown teacher or Black and brown principal, because they are introducing, again, pedagogical frameworks, how to build relationships, how to communicate, how to think about even just resources that they've never been exposed to in their own schooling and education process, to reach, to interest, to engage, and also communicate with diverse communities. So it's also, and they're not getting it often in their ed prep programs. They're often not getting it in their schools' professional development day. It's often in proximity that they've shared that I learned this from the, and so we have to continue to also work to not silo, but also be very intentional about who's being added to instructional leadership spaces, and not the default of, well, 80% of the public school teachers are white, so that means 90% of the instructional coaches, 90-something% of school board members, 90-something% of school leadership, we're also going to follow that same train. That has to be interrupted in order to add, here's frameworks that you've never been exposed to that will be highly effective for all the students that we teach.
Perfect. And in our last minute or so together, I'd be remiss without asking each one of you in your educational journeys. You've been so successful. We've been talking about Black teachers and Black educators this entire time. Would love to know if there's a Black educator who's impacted each of you, and love to give you a few seconds to kind of bring them, voice them over and give them some spotlight.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Gene.
I will share something that's just been charming and I've always thought about, which is I have never had a formal Black teacher, K-12, undergrad, and graduate school. Not one. But my most powerful teacher is actually a Black man in our neighborhood when I was in 9th grade, who dropped out after 8th grade because he was caught up in the criminal system, but was brilliant. So he taught himself how to read. And when I was in 9th grade, he gave me 2 books. He gave me The Prince and the autobiography of Malcolm X, and told me as I was struggling reading it, that through struggle, there's growth, and we could read it together and make meaning. Now, this was a local street friend who was older and who was guiding me. When you juxtapose that to teachers who were giving me middle school materials to read in high school, I quickly understood the importance of high expectations and the ability to grow and learn. And he was the one who made it possible. Bernard.
30 seconds. Sandra Robinson. I had a 10th grade teacher. My grandmother adopted my brother and I when she was 65 years old. She couldn't read or write, but she had a PhD in discipline. And because of that, I was completely dependent upon the teachers in the schoolhouse. And I had a 10th grade teacher, and I was a bit of a knucklehead. So much trauma, so much anger. 10th grade teacher told me to stand up in the middle of the class because I was cutting up. And she said, "Boy, what you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, I'm tall, I play basketball, I'm pretty good. I really want to go to college. And she said, "Boy, sit down, you ain't college material." But I had a 10th grade English teacher named Sandra Robinson, and I was an equal opportunity knucklehead. I cut up in her class, but she was different. She pick you up by your ear, take you outside, and close that door in between that hall locker and that door so that hall monitor wouldn't see you. We don't have those in school anymore. And she would pull out those glasses and say, "You're not going to tear out my class. I don't care anything about your mom being in prison. I don't think anything about your dad being in prison." She said, "What I care about is you. And you have to understand that this is a very difficult world for people who look like you that are not educated. So you got one option, and that's to sit your keister down in my class and get this lesson, because I love you and I care for you, and you will be successful." And I am an old man, but I remember those words as if they were spoken this morning when I was talking to my son. So I live by this creed that what we tell our children, it absolutely matters. Sandra Robinson.
Yeah, for me, really quickly, I mentioned Dr. Martin Ryder, who was the Black man who invited me into the profession. We actually recognized him with the Liberators Award at this the first 2 years ago at the Black Men Educators convening here in Philadelphia. Dr. Martin Ryder recruited Black men, Latinx men, and supported them in becoming teachers. So he's one. Baba Udu Changa was my favorite elementary school teacher. He's my favorite teacher ever. But he was my, first grade through 6th grade. He worked in a school that I attended. And then another, similar to what Gene said, I had someone who was a peer and led me to teaching. So I always recognize, Derek, but I didn't realize the connection till much, much later. 6 months after I graduated from college, I ended up being shot a couple of times and left for dead. But what I found out later during the proceedings was this kid, Derek, he was a year younger. I was 20, he was 19. I had a college degree at 20. He had never finished middle school. And to me, that he was a teacher in a different kind of sense. He gave me this added context of what it meant. And when I first started teaching, when Dr. Martin Ryder recruited me to teach, where I taught was the school that Derek had dropped out of. And so he was a teacher of life to me, of this paradigm that I entered the classroom and school with. Because of his experience, it profoundly shaped my experience as a Black man educator.
Wow. Thank you all so much for not just those reflections, but your entire insights for the duration of this amazing webinar and panel. We are so thankful for your time, to our panelists, and I will leave our panelists with our participants with a few key housekeeping notes before we log off. So this webinar will be uploaded on the Hunt Institute's YouTube channel. So if you search the Hunt Institute on YouTube, it will pop up in a couple of days for your viewing. So you can go back and relive this great experience and really think about some key takeaways or some reflections you have from our panelists. And as I mentioned in the onset, we will share a key takeaways document, which will have some quotes as well as some great facts and resources that we talked about today. And then lastly, we have a slew of upcoming webinars, both this focus from the Race and Education webinar series, as well as some early childhood and higher education webinars that we run through the Hunt Institute. So stay tuned to some additional emails with some incredible webinars coming up in the next month or so. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you again to our panelists, Shreve, Jean, and Harrison, for an incredible conversation. And again, thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time.